The 43 seconds are burned into my memory like a brand on bare skin. Not because the Grand Speaker of the Galactic Council dismissed us. Not because 407 alien civilizations voted against everything we had spent 7 years trying to prove. It was the way they did it, casually, gently, the way you might wave away a child who has just explained, with great seriousness, that there is a monster under the bed. I stood on that platform in a chamber large enough to swallow a city block, surrounded by the quiet breathing sounds of 400 different species filtered through the station's atmosphere regulators. And I watched millennia of accumulated galactic wisdom decide, in less than a minute, that humanity was simply too young to know what it was talking about. I am Commander Alara Voss of the United Earth Defense Corps. I have floated in the void between Jupiter and Saturn, running hull checks on ships that cost more than most countries. I have sat with crew members who did not come back from missions and held the silence with them until there was nothing left to hold. I have made decisions in situations where every available option was a bad one, and I have learned to make them anyway. I thought I had seen everything that could make a person feel small. I was wrong. Nothing in my life prepared me for standing in the conclave chamber and watching centuries of human effort get classified as a mental health concern. That is not an exaggeration. Class Zero threat anxiety is the official diplomatic term used by the Galactic Council for what they politely call unsubstantiated species-level fear response. In plain language, it means paranoia. It means that the Council looked at everything we brought and decided the problem was not out there in the dark between stars, but inside our heads, our own heads. The heads of the species that had independently developed interstellar travel, mapped the gravitational anomalies of the outer rim over 7 consecutive years of deep space observation, and produced a statistical threat model so detailed and so airtight that our own internal review board called it the most alarming document in the recorded history of human science. My colleague, Dr. Owen Clark, was standing beside me when the vote came in. Owen had spent 4 years building that data package, 4 years of 18-hour days, of arguments with review boards, of refining calculations until there was no margin left to question. He was 46 years old and looked 60. There were shadows under his eyes that no amount of rest could shift anymore. When the chamber display lit up with the final tally, 407 votes against us, 5 in favor. He looked at me the way a person looks when they have dropped something irreplaceable and watched it fall in slow motion and hit the floor, and there is nothing to do about it after. I pressed my thumbnail into my palm and said nothing. I had made myself that promise before we even boarded the ship. The conclave station orbited Tau Ceti, 11 light-years from Earth. We had traveled for 3 months to reach it. The station itself was one of the genuine wonders of the known galaxy, built over centuries and added to by dozens of civilizations, each leaving its own architectural signature in the hull and corridors and gathering spaces, so that the whole structure looked less like something built and more like something that had grown, the way a reef grows, slowly, without plan, accumulating itself from the contributions of everything that lived in and around it. The corridors smelled of 100 different atmospheres run through a universal life support system that kept everyone breathing, and nobody entirely comfortable. Our quarters had been designed for a 4-legged species with no apparent concept of privacy, and I had spent 3 months folding myself onto a sleeping platform and staring at a ceiling that glowed faint green and rehearsing what I would say. When we finally stood before the council, I had prepared for skepticism. I had prepared for hard questions and political deflection. I had prepared for requests for longer observation windows and additional peer review and independent verification by bodies we would have to spend another 2 years convincing. I had prepared, in my most pessimistic moments, for a long and difficult diplomatic negotiation that would end in a partial compromise that satisfied nobody completely but at least moved the needle. I had not prepared for simple, comfortable disinterest. The 5 civilizations that voted with us were the only living warmth in that chamber. The Draken, an insectoid species from a binary star system near the galactic rim, had sent a military commander named Veth. He stood at nearly 2.5 meters tall and was built the way mountains are built, with a quality of permanence that had nothing to do with size and everything to do with experience. He had fought in 3 wars before any of the Council's peacekeeping delegates were born. He stood through the entire session with the stillness of a creature that has survived enough things to stop being surprised by them, and his stillness, as I watched the vote come in, did not change at all. That steadiness was the most comforting thing in the room. The Mira were ancient and quiet, represented by a small group of beings who communicated primarily through text displayed on panels they carried, their spoken language having apparently diverged from translatable range several thousand years ago. There were 3 other minor races I barely knew at the time, small civilizations in early stages of galactic integration, voting with us perhaps because they were new enough to the Council to still take warnings from outside it seriously. After the vote, the Grand Speaker spoke again. It thanked us for our contribution to galactic scientific discourse. It expressed hope that we would find peace of mind. It wished humanity continued growth and development. Then the chamber lights dimmed, which a council aide told me afterward was the Athari equivalent of politely ending a meeting and inviting everyone to leave. We were walked to a transit pod by a council attaché whose species I could not identify, who said nothing to us the entire way. Owen waited until the pod door closed behind us and the station was sliding away beyond the glass before he spoke. He said he needed a moment to understand what had just happened. I told him what had happened was exactly what we had feared might happen, and exactly why we had spent the last 2 months before departure drafting contingency plans. He looked at me, he said, "So we are actually going ahead with it?" I said yes. He was quiet for a long time, watching the station shrink in the viewport, that extraordinary irregular structure getting smaller until it was just a light among lights, and then just stars. He said he wished they had at least asked a few more questions. He said it would have been nice to feel like somebody was listening. I looked out at the stars and thought about the readings that had started this whole journey. The gravitational anomalies at the outer rim, the ones that 3 separate survey teams had flagged, and 2 had initially explained away as equipment drift before Owen's team demonstrated they were real, consistent, and moving. The energy signatures that did not match any known natural phenomenon in the galactic database. The mathematical pattern underlying all of the data, which Owen had noticed first on a night when it was late and his coffee was cold, and he had been staring at his screen with the expression of a man who wants very badly to be wrong about something. The pattern was not random. Whatever was producing it was not drifting. It had direction. It had been moving steadily toward the center of the galaxy for what the geological record suggested was an extraordinarily long time. Long enough that whatever was out there had been moving before some of the Council's founding civilizations had developed writing. I did not sleep on the journey home. I spent the 3 months reviewing everything we knew, writing letters to people I trusted, and building the framework of what I had privately been calling, in the parts of my mind I kept for uncomfortable thoughts, the plan we were going to need if the Council said no. By the time Earth's blue curve appeared in the viewport, I had the outline of something concrete. It was not a comfortable plan. It was not the kind of plan you share with diplomats or career politicians, or anyone whose primary professional goal is continued employment. But it was the plan that the situation required, and I had learned long ago that the plan the situation requires and the plan you are comfortable with are rarely the same document. The transit pod moved in silence through the station's internal network. Outside the small windows, the architectural layers of Conclave Station passed in slow sequence, each section built by a different civilization, each one carrying the particular aesthetic signature of a species that had contributed its own vision of permanence to a structure meant to outlast any of its builders. I had found the station extraordinary when we arrived. Now it looked to me like what it actually was, a monument to a peace so long and so complete that the species living within it had forgotten that peace was not the default condition of the universe. It was an achievement. It required maintenance. And the maintenance it required was not ceremony or protocol or the careful management of diplomatic language. It was the willingness to hear a thing you did not want to hear and take it seriously anyway. That willingness had just failed in the most complete way I had seen in my career. I thought about Dr. Lena Marsh, who had been the lead analyst on our first survey team. She had been the one who flagged the anomalies initially, 3 years before Owen built his comprehensive model. And she had been the one who had been told, by the Earth Scientific Review Board at the time, that her instruments needed recalibration. She had recalibrated them. The readings came back identical. She had recalibrated them again. Still identical. She had spent 6 months building the case that the readings were real before anyone with authority had listened, and when they finally did listen, she had cried, quietly, in the hallway outside the review session, not because she was upset but because she was relieved. She had been carrying the weight of being the person who could see something that nobody else wanted to see, and the relief of finally being believed was physical. I had thought about her often during the 7 years of the project. She was back on Earth now, running a research station in New Zealand, continuing the monitoring work that had started everything. She was the reason we had 7 years of data. She was the reason we had been able to make the case at all, even an unsuccessful one. When I got back to Earth, I was going to find a way to tell her that. I did not know yet exactly what I would say. Something that acknowledged that being the first person to see a thing clearly is a particular kind of loneliness, and that her loneliness had been the foundation of everything that came after. Owen was still looking at the stars when I looked at him. He had a particular way of going still when he was thinking that I had learned to read over the years we had worked together. This stillness was different from his usual one. This was the stillness of someone who has arrived at a conclusion and is deciding whether to say it. Out loud he said, "I think they will be sorry." I said I thought so too. He said the question is what sorry costs everyone. I said that was the question, yes. I said that was why we were going home to do what we were going to do. He nodded, very slowly. The way he nodded when he was agreeing with something he wished were not true. Then he put his hands in his pockets and turned away from the window and said, "All right, tell me the plan." I told him the plan. He did not say anything for a while after. Then he said it was audacious. I said yes. He said it would require everything we had. I said yes. He said he did not see an alternative. I said neither did I. He said he would need to go back to Oslo and start immediately. I said I knew. He said one more thing, which was that he wanted to be clear about something. Looking at me, the way he looked at things he considered important enough to look at directly. He said that regardless of how the next 18 months went, the work they had done in the past 7 years had been real and true, and the data was what it was. He said that being disbelieved did not make the thing you were warning about less real. It only changed who was ready for it. I said I knew that. He said he knew I knew. He said he was saying it anyway, because he thought it was worth saying out loud. I pressed my thumbnail into my palm one final time as we entered Earth's gravity field. Then I went to work. The first thing people misunderstand about military preparation is that it looks, from the outside, almost exactly like ordinary industry. You want to build warships on a scale that would alarm the Galactic Council if they were paying attention? Start with civilian freight contracts and call the shipyard an industrial logistics expansion. You want to develop weapons systems that no species in the known galaxy has seen before? Register it as advanced mineral extraction and deep core survey technology. You want to train a generation of soldiers who can operate in conditions so hostile that every standard instinct becomes a liability, who can fight without formation, without broadcasting their position, without any of the rules that 10,000 years of galactic peacetime has. Built around the concept of a battle, build a space exploration program, advertise it as an opportunity. Tell young people it is the frontier, and they will come, because they always do, because that is a thing about humans that never changes regardless of the century or the context. We had 18 months, that was my estimate, built on Owen's models and on my own analysis of the energy readings and on something else, something harder to express in scientific language, which was the intuition that comes from watching a dangerous situation develop for long enough that you stop needing the data to tell you which way it is going. I spent the first 2 weeks back on Earth doing something that surprised everyone who knew my schedule. I did not go to the Defense Corps headquarters. I did not brief the Joint Command or attend the parliamentary security sessions or give any of the press interviews that were being requested. I drove 3 hours north of London, through countryside that was doing what English countryside does in autumn, which is to say looking beautiful and slightly mournful at the same time, to a converted stone farmhouse in Yorkshire where a retired admiral named George Hartley lived with 3 cats and a floor-to-ceiling collection of naval and military history books that covered every conflict humanity had fought from the earliest recorded wars to the most recent orbital. Engagemerge was 71 years old. He had spent 40 years in space before his knees gave out, and in those 40 years he had commanded more operations, in more conditions than anyone else alive whose name I actually knew. He had no official role in anything anymore, which meant he could say things without worrying about the consequences, in ways that people with active careers and public positions could not. I had known him for 15 years and trusted his judgment in the way you trust a compass. Not because it tells you where you want to go, but because it tells you where you are. I told him everything: the council meeting, the vote, the 43 seconds, the data, the contingency framework I had sketched on the journey home. He listened without interrupting, which was unusual for him. He drank his tea, and I drank mine, and the cats arranged themselves around the room, and the fire made its sounds, and he listened. When I finished, he set his cup down on the side table and looked at the fire for a moment. Then he said that the most important thing was that they not know how much I was building until it's too late for the knowledge to matter. I said I knew. He said that meant starting immediately and making everything look like something else from the very first day, not as an afterthought, but as the foundational structure of the operation. I said I had already begun making phone calls on the ship home. He looked at me over the arm of his chair and said, "Good. Then he said, I wish I had my knees back. I said I wished he did too. He said, Elara, they are going to be afraid when the time comes. I said I knew. He said, make sure your people are not. Operation Deep Ward was registered with the Earth Resource Development Authority as a long-term infrastructure expansion program for deep space. Logistics. On paper, and the paper was very clean and very thoroughly audited, it was a network of mining platforms, fuel depots, and communication relay stations to be constructed in Earth's outer orbital zones, across the asteroid belt, and at several points between Earth and the inner edge of the outer rim. None of that was false. The mining platforms were real and operational. The fuel depots functioned exactly as advertised. The communication relays worked and were, in fact, a genuine improvement on what had existed before. But the platforms had structural load-bearing frames capable of being converted to weapons emplacements in under a week with components already stored on site. The fuel depots had storage 4 times what any civilian deep space logistics operation would require. And the communication relays were also listening stations, running passive scans of deep space on frequency ranges that the Council had never seen us use, watching for the pattern that Owen's team had identified. The dark side of the moon became the busiest place in human history during those 18 months. We ran construction shifts around the clock in 3 rotating teams. I visited every 3 weeks, flying in on unmarked civilian transports, wearing no insignia, carrying identification documents that described me as a senior infrastructure development auditor named Caroline Webb. I walked the construction floors. I talked to the workers. I sat in prefabricated site offices with the project leads and argued over resource allocation and delivery timelines until the numbers made sense. The workers knew what they were actually building. We had not hidden that from them. There had been no point in trying, and I did not believe in asking people to risk their lives for something they did not understand. They had all volunteered. I spent a long time thinking, during those 18 months, about what that meant. Thousands of people, across dozens of facilities, working extraordinary hours on an operation that officially did not exist and might turn out to have been unnecessary, working because someone had asked them to, and because the reason was real. There is something about humans that I understood better during those 18 months than I ever had before. When you tell them honestly that there is a genuine danger and you need their help, most of them say yes. Not all, and not always. And sometimes the yes has conditions. But mostly yes. I had known this intellectually. I came to know it in a different way during those months, in the way you know something when you have seen it happen over and over in different faces and different voices. Owen was in Oslo. He was not involved in Operation Deep Ward directly, by my choice and his agreement, because his particular value was in a different place. Owen and a team of 12 specialists that he had assembled from across Earth's research institutions were working in a facility outside the city, on a project that I considered the most important single piece of the entire operation. Not the ships, not the weapons, not the orbital emplacements, the signal. We had been calling the energy readings from the outer rim the Harbinger signal for 2 years by that point, informally at first, and then as the working name that had embedded itself into every document and conversation. Owen's team was trying to understand not just what the signal meant in terms of direction and velocity, but what it was, its architecture, its language, if it had one. The internal structure that might, if we understood it well enough, give us something to work with. He called me 6 weeks into the 18 months. It was 2 in the morning my time, and he sounded the way people sound when they have been awake too long and have found something at the end of the wakefulness that is too important to wait until morning. He said his team had finished the deep structural analysis. He said the signal had internal structure that was consistent with networked coordination, rather than a single source. He said the pattern across 17 outer rim monitoring points was not just directional but simultaneous and geometrically precise, and that the geometry, when he mapped it against the full galactic civilizational distribution chart, corresponded with a degree of accuracy that it could not attribute to coincidence, to the locations of every major inhabited system in the known galaxy. He said the Harbingers, whatever they were, knew exactly where everyone lived. They had a map, they had a plan, they had been following it for a very long time. I sat with that for 30 seconds. Then I asked him how long we had. He said if the approach velocity held with current readings, somewhere between 14 and 20 months. I said we had assumed 18. He said yes. I thanked him. He said Elara, the Athari system, is at the center of that geometric pattern. It is the primary convergence point. The Council's home is the first target. I said I know, Owen. He said they really should have listened. I said they really should have. Then I told him to get some sleep, knowing he would not, and I went back to my own work. We had 5 allies from the Council vote, and I spent several months of those 18 visiting all of them. not as a diplomat. I had no interest in being a diplomat anymore. I went as a soldier who wanted to know how they fought, and what they knew, and what we could learn from each other before the moment arrived. The Draken homeworld took 4 weeks by fast transport, and Veth met me personally at the landing platform. Away from the council chamber, with no diplomatic context, he was even more striking. He moved with the compressed energy of a structure under long pressure that had learned perfect stillness as its natural state. He showed me the Draken training facilities, and I spent 2 weeks watching his people train. I had read about Draken military doctrine before I came. The reality of it was something different from reading. They trained for loss, not to avoid it, but to absorb it and continue. They ran exercises where the point was to keep functioning after a scenario that should have destroyed the unit, to find the next move when there was no obvious next move, to never let the recognition that things had gone wrong translate into paralysis. They did not have a word for retreat. They had several words for regrouping, for repositioning, for tactical withdrawal toward a more advantageous position, but none of those words meant retreat. The concept itself was not in their vocabulary. I showed Veth the schematics for our orbital defense grid and the specs for the ships we were building. He was quiet for a long time, studying the numbers. Then he asked how long construction had taken. I told him we had started drafting the foundational plans before we even boarded the ship to the council. He was still for a moment. Then he made the clicking sound that I would come to recognize as the Draken expression of genuine, considered approval. He asked what I needed from his fleet. I told him I needed them positioned at a specific coordinate, under full communication silence, ready to move on my signal. He said that was something he could arrange. Then he said, and this was the moment I think I understood Veth fully for the first time, that the Draken had been waiting a long time for something worth fighting for. He did not say it dramatically. He said it the way you state a fact that has simply been true for longer than you can remember. The Mira meeting changed the shape of my understanding in a different way. Their world was old in a way that is difficult to describe without making it sound like decay, which it was not. It was a world that had been completely inhabited for so long that the original materials of its ancient structures had been slowly replaced, molecule by molecule, by the planet's own geological processes, until the buildings were simultaneously the oldest things on the surface and entirely made of new material. The keeper, who led the delegation that met me, was small and moved with the careful deliberation of something very old that was still very precise. Within minutes of my arrival, before any formal greeting or session had been arranged, the keeper handed me a data chip. I asked what it was. The keeper said it contained the most complete surviving record of a civilization the Harbingers had encountered before. I asked when. The keeper said a very long time ago. I asked what had happened to that civilization. The keeper said there was no word in any currently spoken language for what had happened, because the civilization no longer existed in any form, including ruins, including the geological traces that normally persist for billions of years. The space the civilization had occupied had been revised so thoroughly that the planet's record of ever having hosted life was gone. I spent 6 hours with the keeper that day. By the end of it, I had a theory about why some civilizations had been erased completely while others, apparently no more defensible, had been passed over. The theory was based on patterns in the archive the keeper shared, cross-referenced with Owen's structural signal analysis. The theory was that the Harbingers did not know what to do with internal conflict, with species that had fought themselves. Every civilization in the archive that had been left alone, even briefly, had in its deep history a record of intense intraspecies warfare. The ones erased without exception had achieved long-term internal peace before the Harbingers reached them. It made a terrible kind of sense. Whatever the Harbingers were built for, they were built for a galaxy of civilizations that had evolved toward stability. They were not designed to encounter species that had spent hundreds of thousands of years refining the art of surviving each other. I did not tell many people about that theory. It was not something I wanted to become a comfortable idea, but I held it close in the months that followed. As the ships on the lunar surface were completed and tested one by one in the dark spaces beyond Pluto, as the listening posts sent back readings that showed the Harbinger signature strengthening and accelerating, I held it close because it told me something I needed to believe at that point, in a way that went past professional confidence. It told me we had a chance. In the 15th month of Operation Deep Ward, something unexpected happened. People started talking, not about the classified details, not in ways that broke security. But workers on the moon talked to their families. Researchers in Oslo talked to colleagues at other institutions. Shipyard crews talked to each other in transit. The collective weight of all that quiet, careful conversation produced something I had not planned for. A mood, not panic, not alarm, a sense, spreading through the people closest to the operation, that something important was being built, and that building it mattered in a way that went beyond the professional. I became aware of this through small signs, overtime requests submitted without prompting, technical teams proposing quality improvements to systems that already met specification. A structural engineer named Colin Webb, no relation to my cover identity, who sent me an unsolicited analysis identifying 3 potential weak points in the platform conversion design, with proposed reinforcements, attached to a note that said only, "Thought you should see this." I implemented all 3 reinforcements and sent a reply that said, "Thank you, this helped." He sent back, "Good." That was the whole exchange. It was one of the most genuinely encouraging conversations I had during those 18 months. Owen sent me one message during those 18 months that I saved, and returned to more times than I would like to admit. It was short. It said that he thought we were going to be ready. He said he did not know if ready would be enough. But he said that at least this time, when it came, we would not be standing empty-handed in front of a chamber full of beings who had already decided not to hear us. This time, he said, we would be the ones choosing how we respond. Something else happened in the 16th month that I recorded and kept in the operational log under a category I created specifically for it, which I labeled Unexpected Positive. The Mira sent a second communication, unprompted, from the facility where the keeper lived. It was a short message, displayed in the formal Mira text format, which said only that the keeper had reviewed the initial public specifications of Operation Deep Ward, the civilian cover version, and that after reviewing them the keeper had authorized the release of additional archived material from the Mira data repository. The authorization, the message said, was being given because the keeper had assessed that the entity requesting it was one that was likely to use the information correctly. That was the complete justification offered. I thought it was the most generous compliment I received during those 18 months, and I thought that for quite a long time before I sent a formal acknowledgement. I read that message the morning the alert came through, the alert that told me the Harbinger signature had crossed from a distant accelerating pattern into something the monitoring system classified as an active approach, something that was no longer out beyond the rim, something that was here. No alarm sounded when it started. That detail, which sounds like it should be the least significant part of the story, turned out to matter in ways I did not fully understand until later. The Harbinger emergence across 17 star systems simultaneously was so precisely timed and so geometrically sudden that the automated early warning sensors on 3 of those systems registered the event and immediately flagged their own readings as sensor malfunction. The systems were working correctly. The event was simply outside any parameter the warning system had been designed to accommodate. It took 11 minutes for the first confirmed visual telemetry to reach the monitoring station on the moon, and another 4 minutes for it to be routed to me. I was in the main operations center, going through morning logistics reports, when the display changed. I looked at it for 3 full seconds before the part of my mind that processes what eyes are showing it caught up. The Ethery system alone showed 9 distinct Harbinger formations in close orbit above the primary inhabited world. 9 formations, each one registering a mass approximately equivalent to a mid-sized moon, covered in structures that the sensors could not classify, because nothing in the reference database corresponded to what they were seeing. The formations held position for approximately 40 seconds after arrival. Then they began. The word we eventually settled on was unmaking. Destruction was not accurate. Destruction implies a before state and an after state. Something changed from what it was into something else. Rubble where there was once structure. Heat where there was once matter. What the Harbingers did was different in a way that took our best physicist years to fully describe. The spatial revision field, which was the name we gave the primary mechanism after Owen's team finished their analysis, did not transform matter. It revised the relationship between matter and the space it occupied, and in that revision the matter simply stopped being present. No explosion, no heat, no debris, a complete absence of quantum signature where an object had been, as though the space had been gently and thoroughly reminded that nothing had ever been there. In the first 4 minutes above A3 Prime, the upper atmosphere of a world home to 40 billion sentient beings began to be removed in this way, layer by layer. The Harbinger formations moved in a slow, deliberate pattern that the analysis team later determined was optimized for maximum coverage per unit of time. They were not in a hurry. They had no reason to be. The Galactic Council's peacekeeping fleet responded within 8 minutes of the first alert. I watched the tactical feed from the operations center with my full team, nobody speaking, all of us doing the arithmetic that none of us wanted to do. The peacekeeping fleet was enormous. 400 years of galactic stability compressed into the largest military force in known space, and it was staffed by commanders who were calm, trained professional, and who had absolutely no experience of combat in any form that the word combat actually covered. They had trained extensively. Training and experience are not the same thing in ways that become critical at exactly the wrong moment. The fleet formed up in standard approach configuration, which was orderly and coordinated and telegraphed their position and intent to the Harbinger, formations with perfect clarity. The Harbingers held position until the fleet was within engagement range. Then the spatial revision field deployed in a directed configuration, focused into a tight cone, and the first 3 wings of the peacekeeping fleet stopped existing. No debris, no explosion. The space they had occupied became, in the precise language of our sensors, unoccupied. The remaining fleet adjusted formation and pressed forward anyway, because their commanders had no protocol for the situation they were in, and because the human concept of overwhelming odds had not been built into a military culture that had never needed it. The entire peacekeeping fleet was gone in 11 minutes. Declan Ford, who had been my communications officer for 4 years, and who had the particular quality of staying completely level when everything around him is, tapped my shoulder. He said the Council emergency channel had gone active and was requesting a connection to the United Earth Defense Corps Command Authority. I looked at the tactical display for another moment. 17 systems, simultaneously. The exact geometric pattern Owen had mapped from 7 years of signal data, now playing out in real time with the precision of something that had been planned for a very long time. I felt many things looking at that display. I let myself feel exactly none of them. I told Declan to connect the channel. The Moon Operations Center had a window. Somebody in the original design team had included it as an unnecessary luxury, and now I was grateful. Outside, the Earth turned in its own light, blue and white and impossibly ordinary from this distance. 48 hours ago, the biggest problem on that planet was a shipping consortium dispute and a regional drought. I had read that briefing. I always read the ordinary briefings. The world does not stop being the world because you are watching the horizon for something terrible. Now the horizon had arrived. The HFY Prime feed updated every 30 seconds. The numbers said the same thing each time I read them. I made myself read them anyway. In a situation like this, the temptation is to stop looking at what is actually happening and work from internal models instead. The internal model is always cleaner and more manageable than the real thing. It is also less accurate. I kept the display active. I kept reading the numbers. I was aware, in the 40 seconds between connecting the channel and hearing the first voice, of every person in the operations center with me. 11 people. I knew all of them. Lieutenant Bridget Howell on sensor analysis, who had been part of the Outer Rim monitoring program since its 2nd year, and knew the Harbinger signal data as well as Owen did, with the additional quality of being able to translate it in real time without pausing to verify herself. Warrant Officer Sam Curry on tactical, with the fastest hands on a targeting interface I had ever watched, who had asked me when I recruited him only one question: whether we were going to be doing something that actually mattered. I had said yes. He had said that was enough. Sergeant Nadia Cross on communications support, managing the relay between the facility and the pre-positioned fleet while simultaneously logging everything that came through 4 Council emergency frequencies, because Nadia believed in the record and in the value of being able to read back exactly what happened after the fact. All of them had put themselves here voluntarily. All of them had looked at the same information I had looked at, made the same assessment, and chosen to be in the room when it happened. That awareness did not make the decisions easier. It made them more serious, which was the correct relationship to have with decisions of this kind. The Council Emergency Coordinator came back on the line while Civ was still processing our terms, a different voice this time, thinner, faster, clearly operating from a secondary station. They said that the situation on HFY Prime was developing faster than initial projections. They said that the secondary impact sites were now confirmed active in 11 of the 17 systems. They said the estimated timeline for total atmospheric loss on HFY Prime was 4 hours at the current rate of progression. I said I understood the timeline. I said the terms I had stated remained the terms. The voice went away. Bridget said quietly that the Harbinger formations in the Tau Ceti system were holding position at standard distance from the station. She said they had not moved since emergence. I asked if they appeared to be targeting the station specifically. She said no. She said they appeared to be waiting. I asked what they might be waiting for. She said she did not know, but that the pause was consistent with an operational sequence where the primary objective required some preceding condition to be met before. Secondary objectives were engaged. I told her to keep monitoring and to flag any change immediately. She said she would. Sam said the fleet pre-positioning was holding at the designated coordinates. He said the Draken contingent had gone to full active status on the signal and were awaiting the deployment command. He said the Mira vessels had completed their formation alignment and were ready. He said the Earth fleet was at combat readiness across all systems. He delivered this information in the flat, precise voice he used when he wanted you to understand he was telling you exactly what he knew, and nothing else. I thanked him. I looked at the clock on the display. 31 seconds left on the offer I had given Civ. Nadia said the council session log was showing the emergency vote had been called. She said the vote was in progress. She said she would track it and report the result as it came in. I said good. I looked at the display showing HFY Prime. I looked at the Earth turning in the window. I looked at the clock. The voice that came through the emergency channel did not belong to the Grand Speaker. The Grand Speaker was on HFY Prime. I chose not to think about that too carefully in that moment. The voice belonged to a council emergency coordinator named Civ, a Lumari, whose species used light pulse communication, that the translation system rendered as a slightly clipped, formally structured version of whatever language you chose. Civ said the council was requesting immediate military assistance from all member and associate civilizations. Civ said the threat had been reclassified as extinction category. Civ said they were looking for any available response capability and would the United Earth Defense Corps please confirm what resources were currently deployable. I said I understood the situation. I said I had been watching it develop for 7 years. Civ paused. The pause lasted approximately 2 seconds. 2 seconds is a very short time, and in those 2 seconds the quality of Civ's attention changed in a way I could hear even through the translation layer. It was the shift that happens when someone on the other end of a conversation realizes they are not talking to the person they thought they were talking to. Civ said carefully that they understood Earth had some defense capability. Civ said the council would be grateful for Earth's assistance in this emergency. I looked at Declan. He looked back at me. He did not say anything, but his expression said he knew exactly what was coming next and that he had been waiting for it for approximately 18 months. I told Civ that Earth had defense resources that were, at this moment, fully ready to deploy. I said they were considerable. I said that humanity had spent the previous 18 months building, training, and preparing for exactly the scenario currently playing out on every screen in every council facility, while the council had spent that same period classifying our warning as a mental health issue and doing nothing. I said we were willing to commit every ship we had built, every weapon we had designed, and every human life that had volunteered for this operation to the defense of the galaxy. Then I said the next part, at the pace of someone who needs to be certain they are being understood correctly, not as a negotiating position but as a statement of simple fact. I said humanity required formal recognition of full sovereign equality within the governing structure of the Galactic Council. We required the immediate permanent removal of our probationary status. We required a seat at the governing table with the same standing and voice as any founding civilization, and we required that these terms be agreed to, formally and on the record, before a single human ship engaged a single Harbinger formation. I told Civ the offer was open for 60 seconds. I said this without raising my voice. I said it in the same register I would have used to give a navigation instruction or a maintenance schedule, up to date. The register was deliberate. The offer was not a threat, and it was not an emotional appeal. And it was not a negotiating position designed to be bargained down. It was a statement of terms from a party that had something the other party needed, and was prepared to provide it for a specific and defined consideration. Business, in the most straightforward sense of the word. The most important business anyone in that chamber had ever been asked to conduct, but business nonetheless. I wanted the tone to reflect that clearly. Civ put me on hold. I watched the display. Above HFY Prime, the atmospheric revision was progressing steadily downward. The numbers changed with the mechanical consistency of something following a program, without variation or acceleration or delay. I watched the numbers and I did not look away, and I let 60 seconds pass in the way that 60 seconds passes when you are the only person in the room who is not afraid. Civ came back at 41 seconds. Civ said an emergency vote had been called. Civ said it had passed. Civ said the terms were accepted. I told Declan to send the Splinter Pact signal. He sent it immediately, one command, and 11 light minutes away in a region of deep space that no council sensor array had ever been directed toward. The combined human and allied fleet came active. The ships we had built on the moon, the Draken warships positioned there by Veth in complete communication silence for the past 6 weeks. The Mira research vessels, Ancient and quietly devastating, repurposed under the Keeper's authorization. The combined fleet was not the largest force in galactic history. It was the most prepared force in galactic history, which is a different thing and a more important one. At the center of the formation was the ship we had named the Owen Clark. She carried the device, Owen's team's final gift, the signal disruptor built from 3 years of frequency analysis, designed to find the heart of the Harbinger network and make it forget how to coordinate with itself. The splinter-packed signal took 11 light minutes to reach the pre-positioned fleet. During those 11 minutes I did something I had not given myself permission to do in a long time. I sat down. Not strategically, not as a tactic to project calm. I sat down in the chair at my station because my legs had decided the time for standing was temporarily over, and I let myself think about everything that had led to this exact moment. The 7 years of watching. The 3 months on a ship heading to a chamber where we would be dismissed. The 18 months of building something while the rest of the galaxy slept. Owen in Oslo. Veth on his homeworld with his arms crossed and his stillness that meant he was paying exact attention. The Keeper handing me a chip containing a civilization that no longer existed. The workers on the moon who had said yes without being asked twice. I thought about all of it for approximately 90 seconds. Then I thought about the next 20 minutes, which was all that was relevant now. Bridget said the Harbinger formations in the Tau Ceti system had shifted. Not toward the station. Away from it, toward the outer edge of the system, which was consistent with the geometric pattern Owen had mapped. They were not interested in Conclave Station. They were moving to the next point on their chart. Whatever had been at the center of that chart had been addressed, or was in the process of being addressed, and now they were continuing. Sam said the fleet signal should have reached the pre-position coordinates. He said we would know in 11 minutes whether it had been received cleanly. I said I knew. He said he was noting it for the log. I said thank you, Sam. He said yes, Commander. Nadia said 3 more Council civilizations had opened emergency channels in the past 4 minutes, 2 requesting information on the status of our assistance commitment, 1 requesting evacuation guidance for their home systems. I said to tell the first 2 that assistance was incoming and to sit tight. I said to tell the third that I did not have evacuation guidance to offer, and that the best thing they could do was prepare their own defense capability for the arrival of the fleet. She relayed those responses with the precision I expected from her, adding nothing and removing nothing. At the 11-minute mark, Sam said the fleet was confirmed active. He said all pre-positioned groups were reporting ready. He said the Owen Clark was showing fully operational. He said the Draken contingent had transmitted a single-word response to the activation signal, which the translator rendered as a Draken term that had no direct equivalent, but which Sam had been told by a Draken liaison officer meant something approximately like, finally, I stood up. I opened the fleet-wide channel and waited until the line was confirmed clear. My voice went out to every ship, every crew, every human and Draken and Mira on board. I said we told them, and they did not listen, and that did not change what we were here to do. I said move to assigned positions. Follow your training. And remember that whatever those formations out there were built to fight, they were not built to fight us. The fleet began to move. The Lumari had a saying that one of their liaison officers shared with me during the 3rd week of combined operations, while we were standing in a corridor outside the tactical room. After a session that had been difficult for reasons that had nothing to do with the Harbingers. The saying, roughly translated, was that a battle is a question to which both sides already know the answer. It was a framework for understanding conflict that had served the Lumari well for several thousand years of galactic politics. It was catastrophically inadequate for the current situation, and the liaison officer knew it, which was why he said it with an expression that I can only describe as a person watching the tool they have relied on their entire life fail in front of them and not yet knowing what to reach for instead. I did not say that to him. I said something about adapting frameworks. I waited until I was alone with Declan later, and then I said it. He laughed for the first time in what felt like considerably longer than it actually had been, and I thought that was worth more than the laugh itself, that a person under that much pressure could still find something to laugh at. The first engagement of what was later named the War of Unmaking lasted 9 hours. It was nothing like the 11 minutes that had eliminated the peacekeeping fleet. It was nothing like any engagement in the history of documented galactic warfare, which was partly the point. The Harbingers had come prepared for every documented form of galactic combat and for many undocumented forms that their systems had modeled based on behavioral analysis of known species. What they had not prepared for, what nothing in the galaxy had given them reason to prepare for, was combat designed from the ground up to look like nothing they had modeled. We did not advance in formation. We flew in patterns that shifted every 4 minutes, according to a randomized algorithm that I had designed specifically to resist any pattern recognition system, because a randomized pattern cannot be predicted, and a pattern that cannot be predicted cannot be targeted. We did not broadcast identification signals. We transmitted false signatures from decoy positions while actual ships moved in different directions. We used the debris from the peacekeeping fleet's elimination as cover, flying through regions of space that were technically navigable but that violated every accepted principle of safe transit. We feigned retreat and attacked from the direction of the retreat. We attacked from multiple vectors simultaneously and then did not press any of them, pulling back before the targeting systems could lock, and then attacking again from entirely different positions before the systems could reset. The Harbingers had been built for a galaxy of civilizations that fought like civilizations. They had been built for orderly, legible, rule-governed conflict, because that was the only kind of conflict the galaxy had produced in the past 10,000 years of relative peace. Their targeting systems were exceptional at tracking organized formations. They were significantly less effective at tracking something that was not organized. Not disorganized, which is different, and which would simply have looked like noise. Deliberately and specifically anti-organized. Engineered chaos is not the same as chaos. It is chaos with a purpose, which is the hardest thing in the universe to defend against because it does not look like anything you have seen before. We still lost ships. I want to say this clearly and without minimizing it. The War of Unmaking was not a story of humanity arriving and winning easily what the galaxy had lost immediately. We lost ships and we lost people, and every loss registered in me in a place that I had learned, years ago, to keep separate from the part that needed to keep making decisions. The separation is not the same as not feeling it. It is something harder than not feeling it. It is carrying the full weight of it while walking forward anyway, because the only alternative is to stop, and stopping is the one thing you cannot do. On the 4th day of engagement, the Draken contingent held a position at the edge of the Ethery system for 6 hours under direct and sustained Harbinger attention. They held it so the rest of the fleet could reposition without being tracked. Veth commanded that action from his flagship personally. When it was over and the comms reconnected, 3 of every 10 Draken ships that had entered that engagement were gone. I reached Veth and he sounded exactly as he always sounded, steady, focused entirely on what needed to happen next, as though what had just happened behind him was already in a different category than what was in front of him. I asked if he needed to pull his remaining ships back. He said no. He said the position had held. I said I knew. He said, in the direct way he had of delivering information without ornament, that the Harbingers were slower in their targeting refresh than the models had projected. He offered this a useful tactical datum. I wrote it down. I moved to the next decision. Managing the broader Allied fleet was a different kind of difficulty. The species that had joined us from outside the Splinter Pact, the additional civilizations that had committed forces after the Council accepted our terms, came from the same long tradition of structured conflict that the peacekeeping fleet had come from. They were not cowards. The courage was there. What was not there was the instinct for the kind of fighting I was asking them to do, and an instinct cannot be installed in a few weeks of retraining the way a skill can. You can teach a person new tactics. You cannot teach them, quickly, to feel that those tactics are natural, and there is a gap between knowing what to do and feeling that it is right to do it. And in that gap, under enough pressure, people revert. Pyrrha, the Veleth commander I had first briefed 3 months earlier, requested a direct conversation with me in the 5th week of the war. Pyrrha communicated through skin color shifts that the translator rendered as careful, precise English. Pyrrha said that the methods we were using felt, at a level below training and tactical decision-making, fundamentally wrong. Not strategically wrong, morally wrong. Pyrrha was not accusing me. Pyrrha was being precise. I said I understood the distinction and I asked Pyrrha to keep talking. Pyrrha said that in Veleth culture, and Pyrrha believed, in most galactic cultures, a conflict was understood as a kind of dialogue. 2 parties in disagreement, testing the disagreement against each other, arriving through that test at a resolution. Deception in that framework was not just tactically inadvisable. It was a violation of what conflict was for. It said the other party was not worth honest engagement. Pyrrha said they understood intellectually that the Harbingers were not a party to be engaged in dialogue. But the understanding was intellectual. The instinct was different. I thought about what George had said in the farmhouse, about making sure my people were not afraid. I thought about what the Keeper had told me about the civilizations in the archives that had been passed over. I said to Pyrrha that I was not asking them to abandon their values. I was asking them to apply those values to a situation those values had not been designed for, which was a different thing. I said the harbingers were not in disagreement with us. They had no position that could be reached or reasoned with. They were a process, not a party. And the only honest response to a process that intends to erase you is to survive the process. Pyrrha was quiet for a long time. Then Pyrrha asked why humans seemed to find this easier than everyone else. I told Pyrrha about a conversation I had been having with myself since the Keeper handed me the data chip on the Mira homeworld. I said I thought it was because humans had spent the majority of their evolutionary history as something that other things hunted. We had been, for far longer than we had been anything else, the smaller and more vulnerable party in a situation. We had built every instinct we possessed around the assumption that circumstances could always deteriorate, and that adaptation was not optional. We had made war on each other and made peace, and made war again for reasons ranging from necessity to pure short-sightedness. And in all of that we had learned, in a way that is deeper than culture and closer to something structural, that survival requires you to keep changing what you are willing to do. Pyrrha's colors shifted through a range I had no translation for. Then Pyrrha said that sounded like a difficult way to exist. I said yes. I said it had also turned out to have some uses. Pyrrha said they would implement the new movement protocols with their contingent. Then Pyrrha said one more thing, offered in the precise, careful way that Pyrrha said everything. Pyrrha said they wanted me to know that the Velith civilization had discussed, in the years before the crisis, the possibility that the Council's position on the human warning might be wrong. They had discussed it and had ultimately decided that raising the question with the Council would accomplish nothing, because the Council's position was not based on a misreading of the data. It was based on something older than data, which was the settled certainty of civilizations that had been safe for so long they had lost the vocabulary for danger. Pyrrha said they were sorry they had not found a way to say that more loudly at the time. I said I appreciated that. I said we were all in the same position now regardless of what had been said before. Pyrrha said yes. Pyrrha said they found that oddly equalizing. I said I thought it was. I also spoke in that same period with a commander from the Halvari fleet named Leah, who had been Adis's second-in-command and who had taken over operational management of the Halvari contingent while Adis was managing the broader fleet integration. Leah was younger than most of the commanders in the combined force and had a directness that I found useful. She came to me with a tactical observation about the Harbinger revision field that her team had developed from watching the early engagement data, which was that the field's effective range appeared to decrease significantly when operating against multiple small targets, moving in different directions rather than against fewer large targets moving together. She said the math suggested that dispersal was more protective than formation, regardless of what the formation was doing. I asked her to quantify it. She gave me numbers. The numbers were sound. I adjusted the movement algorithm to weight dispersal higher than it had been weighted before. The next engagement showed a measurable improvement in survival rates for the dispersed groups. I sent Leah a message that said, "Good work." She sent back, "It is what the data said." I thought that was the right answer. Owen called me in the 7th week. The signal disruptor was ready. The device had been built from the frequency analysis that his team had been developing for 3 years. And the theory was this: the Harbingers were not independent units. They were nodes in a single distributed network, coordinated by a signal passing between them that kept the whole system synchronized. Without that synchronization, each node would revert to a simpler operational mode. In that simpler mode, according to Owen's models, they were significantly more vulnerable. The spatial revision fields would lose their targeting precision. The coordination that made them nearly impossible to engage effectively would fail. The problem was the disruptor needed to be inside the primary Harbinger cluster to deploy. The primary cluster was at the geometric center of their attack pattern. It was the most heavily defended point in 17-star systems. Owen said he could not model a positive survival outcome for a ship that entered that position with the current tactical situation. He said this with a careful precision of someone who does not want to be misunderstood. Then he said he had a suggestion about who should deploy it. His voice had the particular quality it had when he was about to say something he knew I would not want to hear. I told him no before he could finish the sentence. He said he had already designed the deployment system for manual operation. I said we would find another approach. He said there was no other approach, that remote deployment was not viable because the Harbinger network would intercept any external signal, that this required a physical presence inside the cluster. I was quiet for a while. He let me be quiet. Outside the operations room window, I could see a portion of the combined fleet in loose formation, arranged in the deliberately imperfect pattern I had designed, holding position in the dark between star systems. I told him I was going. He said he had expected I would say that. I said I was the best pilot in the fleet, and that was not pride, it was a relevant capability assessment, and I would appreciate it if he did not argue with it. He said he agreed with the assessment. He said he would transmit the technical specifications within the hour. Then he said that working alongside someone who actually listened to what the data was telling them had been one of the most meaningful experiences of his life. I said the same was true for me. He said he thought this was going to work. I said I believed him. We did not say goodbye. Neither of us said it. I flew out the following morning. The action at the Shattered Veil, which was the name later given to the region of space, where the primary cluster had positioned itself, in a dense field of collapsed star debris that scattered sensor signals and made navigation deeply unpleasant for anything running standard systems, was the most complex coordinated operation I had ever been part of planning. The debris field scattered the Harbinger's targeting data as much as it scattered ours, which was why I had chosen it as the deployment site 3 weeks earlier. When the cluster's position became fixed enough to plan around, the Draken ran the primary engagement on the cluster's approach axis, the most direct and aggressive attack profile we had run in the entire war, designed to pull the Harbinger targeting attention toward the most obvious threat. The Velith and Cephine contingents ran simultaneous flanking movements on the debris field's outer perimeter. The Earth ships generated decoy signatures across a wide arc, each one convincingly close to a real ship's profile, and I flew the Owen Clark into the debris field on a trajectory that no training manual anywhere in the known galaxy would have approved, running entirely on visual navigation and the spatial awareness that 4 years of difficult operations in difficult conditions had built into. Something close to instinct. I found the core. I deployed the device. Then I flew in the only available direction, which was away from the core and through the debris field, on no planned route, with no pattern, because I had planned for the deployment and not for what came after. And the only way out was the way that presented itself moment to moment. The Owen Clark took significant damage. My engines went down approximately 40 seconds from the edge of the debris field. Declan, who I had not asked to follow me, and who had followed me without asking, pulled me out on a tow cable from a support vessel he had positioned himself 2 hours before the operation began. Because he had looked at my plan and identified the thing I had not accounted for and had accounted for it without telling me because he had correctly assessed that I would have told him not to. The signal disruption took 4 seconds to cascade across the full Harbinger network. I did not see it happen. I heard it. Across 17 communication channels, across every language the translator was running, I heard the commanders of the combined fleet say, in their various ways, the same thing. That the Harbinger formations had stopped moving. That the spatial revision fields had deactivated. That the network was, across all 17 systems simultaneously, no longer responding. Veth's voice came through last. He said the position was secure. He said the Draken confirmed across all engagement zones. He said, in the tone of someone making an observation rather than a declaration, that it appeared to be over. I was still in the tow cable, floating with no power, watching the debris field recede behind us, and I said yes. I said it appears to be over. I said thank you, Veth. He clicked. I closed my eyes. I gave myself 60 seconds. In those 60 seconds I thought about the device deploying, about the 4 seconds of cascade, about its 91% confidence and what the remaining 9% would have looked like, about Veth clicking on the comm line and the specific sound that produced, which I would carry for the rest of my life in the category of sounds that meant something was being acknowledged that was too large for words, about Declan and his tow cable, and the 2 hours he had spent positioning himself without telling me, because he had looked at my plan and found the gap and filled it, which was, I thought, the most accurate summary of what good people do when they are working alongside you, and they trust that the work matters. Then I told Declan to get us to a repair bay. We had a galaxy to figure out what to do with. The chamber was quieter the second time. That is the first thing I noticed when I walked in. Not the empty seats, though there were many, entire delegations missing because the civilizations that would have filled them no longer had the numbers to send a formal representation. Not the new faces, unfamiliar species that had never been invited to the table before, and who sat with the particular alertness of people who are not, yet sure whether they are guests or participants. The first thing was the quiet. 10,000 years of galactic civilization had filled this place with a specific sound. The sound of beings who have not been seriously afraid in a very long time, who carry the comfort of stability the way a person carries warmth from a fire they have been sitting beside long enough to forget it is a fire. That sound was gone from the room. What had replaced it was different, careful, present. The sound of people who had been reminded what it meant to nearly stop existing, and who were sitting with that knowledge in a way they could not yet fully articulate. Veth stood at the center podium. The Draken delegation had proposed him as the presiding authority for the founding session, and nobody had argued. He wore no ceremonial garments. Ceremony was not something the Draken invested in under ordinary circumstances, and the circumstances were not ordinary. He opened the session by stating, in the direct and unembellished way he did everything, that the Galactic Council of Civilization was, as of this assembly, formally dissolved, and that what was convening in its place was the Council of Stewardship. He said it had a different name, because it was a different thing with a different purpose, and it would be a dishonesty to the dead to pretend otherwise. He said there were a great many dead. He said we would not be pretending otherwise about anything, starting now. Nobody argued. The chamber was very quiet for a moment after he spoke. I sat in Earth's seat and let the quiet be what it was. I had not slept well since the war ended. That statement is too simple for what was actually true. I had slept. My body had required it and my body had gotten it. But the sleep had a quality that I had not experienced before, which was that I was not fully in it. Part of me stayed awake even when the rest was not, standing watch in some internal room, unable to be fully certain that the emergency was over. The therapist at the medical corps facility outside Edinburgh, where I had gone twice in the months after the final battle, said this was a normal response to sustained high-pressure operations and would ease with time. I believed her professionally. The part of me standing watch was less convinced. Owen's absence was the central fact of the aftermath for me, the one that everything else arranged itself around. He had been in Oslo when the Harbingers made their second wave push into the inner systems, 6 weeks before the final battle. The second wave push was less coordinated than the first, which we understood later to mean that the early disruption work, during the initial weeks of the war, had already begun to degrade the networks. Precision, less coordinated did not mean insignificant. The Oslo facility was not a military installation. There was no reason, from any tactical framework, that it should have been hit. It was hit anyway, because the second wave push was casting wider, and because the Harbingers in that state were not precise. I had been in a strategy session when Declan gave me the message. I had read it. I had put it in the interior room, where I was putting things that needed to be felt properly, when there was time to feel them properly. I had finished the session. What I found when I eventually opened the interior room was not what I had expected. I had expected grief in its ordinary form, which I knew, which I had experienced before and understood how to move through. What I found was something different. A kind of structural absence, as though a load-bearing element had been removed and the rest of the building was still standing but was now standing differently than it had been designed to stand. I was dealing with it. I expected it to take a while. The Edinburgh therapist said this was also normal. I believed her professionally about that too. Declan was in the gallery behind me in the chamber. He had left the Defense Corps after the final battle and was currently not sure what he was doing next, which I thought was a completely reasonable state to be in. He had been at my side through everything, through every session and every crisis and every decision where every available option was bad, and a choice had to be made anyway. He had followed me into the debris field without being asked because he had looked at my plan and identified the gap I had left in it, which was me, and had filled the gap. I thought he deserved to sit in a gallery without any responsibilities for a while. He gave me a small nod when I glanced up at him. I turned back to the podium. Veth called on me to address the assembled delegates. I walked to the speaking position at the center of the chamber floor, the same position I had stood in years ago with Owen beside me and 407 votes about to go against everything we had worked to prove. The chamber looked different from this angle now, and it looked the same. The architecture was unchanged. The light fell in the same way, but the faces in the gallery, those that remained, looked back at me with an attention that the first session had entirely lacked. They were not waiting for me to finish. They were listening. I had written what I wanted to say, and then set it aside and written it again from a different direction, and then set that aside as well. In the end, I came to the podium with nothing prepared except the truth, which was the only thing I fully trusted anymore after everything that had happened. I said that humanity had stood in this chamber before, with data that should have changed every decision made in the following 2 years. I said the council had voted, and the vote had gone the way it went, and we were all living now in the specific shape of world that vote had helped create. I said I had no interest in standing here and assigning blame for that, because blame looked backward, and we had a great deal of forward-facing work to do, and I was not willing to spend the time we had on the wrong direction. I said I understood why the vote had gone as it did. 10,000 years of sustained peace produces a particular kind of certainty, a certainty that is not stubbornness or laziness, but something built slowly into the structure of how a civilization sees the world. And that kind of certainty is genuinely difficult to argue with from the outside, especially when you are arguing from a position of being smaller and newer and less established. I said, if I had spent 10,000 years without encountering a genuine threat, I could not be fully certain I would have voted differently. I was not sure that was true. But I said it because what came next required honesty from everyone in the room, and honesty from everyone in the room required honesty from me first. Several delegations shifted. Pira's colors moved through several quiet variations. I continued. I said we had prepared a framework for a new governing structure. I placed the document on the speaker's display and activated the projection. I said we were calling it the Voss Accords, which had not been my idea and which I had eventually accepted on the grounds that someone's name needed to be on it and the Splinter Pact nations had voted. I read the provisions aloud and offered the full text for individual review. The first provision established that no warning from any recognized civilization, regardless of its standing, its age, its development level, or its membership status within the Council, could be dismissed or deprioritized without mandatory independent investigation. The investigation had to be conducted by a committee of no fewer than 7 civilizations, none of which could be the civilization issuing the warning, and none of which could be the civilization the warning was about. The investigation had to be completed within 6 standard months, and the findings made available to every member civilization, without restriction. No vote to dismiss or deprioritize could be called until the investigation's report was public. I read this provision twice. I wanted it to be clearly understood. The second provision established Earth's permanent seat at the Council of Stewardship, with full founding status and the same standing and voice as any other founding civilization. I said this was not open to negotiation, and I explained why in simple terms. We had earned it through preparation, through alliance building, through the Splinter Pact that had been the only organized response capability in existence when the crisis arrived, and through the operational command that had produced the outcome we were all now sitting in this room to discuss. I said this without aggression. It was simply accurate. The third provision, which had been Veth's suggestion, and which I thought was the most important one in ways that would only be clear over the long term, required that every member civilization of the Council of Stewardship maintain a defined level of active readiness. Not a peacekeeping fleet, active readiness, a genuine military and emergency response capability regularly tested, openly reported, and capable of rapid deployment. The provision included language that Veth had drafted himself, in the Draken style of stating things plainly. Peace is a condition that must be actively maintained and not a condition that can be assumed. The work of maintaining peace is a shared responsibility of all members, and cannot be delegated to the hope that threats will announce themselves, with sufficient warning. There were 23 provisions in total. I summarized the remaining ones and said we had already ratified the framework within the Splinter Pact nations and were prepared to wait as long as necessary for remaining deliberations. Veth asked if any delegate wished to speak before deliberations began. There was a pause, the kind that happens when a room full of people each waits to see if someone else will go first. Then the Mira section stood, not the keeper I had met years ago, whose age I could not measure and whose pace had been very slow. A different Mira delegate, younger in whatever way that concept applied, who moved with slightly more speed and whose eyes caught the chamber light in the same way. The delegate held a text panel, and the translation system rendered its contents to the room. The text said that the Mira archives contained records of 5 previous instances in which a civilization or group of civilizations had faced threat of the category we had just survived. The text said that in 4 of those instances the civilization had not survived. The text said that in the 5th there was a partial record, fragmentary, which the Mira had spent a very long time trying to fully interpret. They now believed they understood what that surviving civilization had done differently than the 4 that had not made it. The surviving civilization, when the crisis came, had listened to the members of their community who were considered minor or marginal or insufficiently established to be taken seriously. They had set aside the assumption that age and stability were the same as wisdom. They had found that wisdom sometimes from those who still remembered what it felt like to be afraid. Because the memory of fear, in the right hands, is not a weakness, it is a kind of knowledge. The Mira delegate lowered the panel and looked at me across the chamber floor with those light-catching eyes. Then they sat down. The deliberations took 4 days. I spent much of that time on the observation deck of the conclave station, the same one I had used years ago after the first vote. The stars were unchanged. Beyond the hull of the station, the universe continued to be vast and indifferent and ancient, and somewhere out in it, a colony ship from Earth, was making its way toward a system in the outer rim that our surveys had flagged as worth a closer look. The colony ship had launched 3 weeks before the Accord's vote, before we knew how the vote would go, because that was what we did. We had been through an extraordinary period of loss and violence and existential uncertainty, and we had launched a colony ship anyway, because the alternative was to stop moving, and we had never been particularly good at stopping. I thought about Owen a great deal on that observation deck. I thought about the morning in Oslo, years ago, when he had called me at 2 a.m, with the voice of a man who had found something terrible. I thought about the specific way he looked when he was about to say something he knew was going to be uncomfortable, the slight tensing around his eyes, the careful choice of the first word. I thought about the message he had sent during those 18 months, the one I had saved, the one about being ready. I thought about the fact that we had never said goodbye, that neither of us had been willing to say it, and that this felt right to me even now. Goodbye is a kind of conclusion. We had not reached one. I thought about Veth holding position for 6 hours in the Ethery system. I thought about Pyrrha's question and my answer, about the evolutionary memory of fear and what it builds in a species over time. I thought about George Hartley in his farmhouse in Yorkshire, with his cats and his fire and his 40 years of difficult experience, saying "good girl" in the voice of someone who did not give out compliments easily and meant them when he did. I thought about Declan in the debris field, positioning his support vessel 2 hours before the operation, not asking permission, filling the gap I had left in my own plan. I thought about the workers on the moon who had said yes without being asked twice. On the 4th day, Veth reconvened the full chamber. The vote on the Voss Accords proceeded provision by provision, as we had agreed. 3 delegations had procedural objections to specific language in 4 of the 23 provisions, and those objections were legitimate and documented for committee resolution. The core framework, the investigation requirement, the founding seats including Earth's, the readiness mandate, the shared responsibility clause, ratified by every remaining civilization in the chamber. Veth made the formal announcement in the plain, precise way he made every announcement. Then he looked across the chamber floor at me and performed the formal Draken gesture of deepest respect, the mandible movement I had first seen him make in the council chamber after the Mira delegates sat down. Around the gallery, in their own forms, the other delegates followed. Light shifts and posture changes and sounds that arrived without translation, but with meaning that needed none. I stood and received it. I thought about saying something that would mark the moment with the weight it deserved. In the end, I said thank you, and I said we had a great deal of work ahead, and we should probably begin. Declan was waiting outside when I came through the chamber doors. He had his jacket over one arm, and the expression of someone managing several large things at once, with the composure of someone who has had considerable practice. He asked how it had gone. I told him the Accords had passed. He said that was good. I said yes. He looked at me for a moment, the way he looked at me when he was deciding whether to say the next thing. Then he said, "You know he would have been completely insufferable about this. He would have had the calculations ready, framed and hanging, first thing in the morning." I said I know. I said I was counting on it. We walked together down the long corridor of the conclave station, past the layered architecture of 100 civilizations, and the filtered air that still smelled of 100 different atmospheres, past the empty sections that no longer had anyone to fill them, and the new sections that were still being arranged, toward the docking bay where the rebuilt Owen Clark was berthed. Declan had not asked what my plans were after this. I had not asked what his were. We had spent 4 years knowing what came next because there had always been a next that required immediate attention. The experience of not knowing was unusual. I was learning to be in it. We reached the docking bay. The Owen Clark sat in her berth, rebuilt around the original ship's salvaged core, carrying the same name and the same purpose. I stood in front of her for a moment, before boarding. Through the bay's observation panels, the stars were visible in the particular way they look from inside a station, framed and still, not moving the way they move when you are traveling through them. The colony ship was out there, heading outward. A few thousand people, lives in storage, moving toward something they had not seen yet in a direction they had not been before. Moving because there was more to find and they wanted to find it. Moving because that was what we did and we had not stopped doing it even in the hardest period in our history, and this was not a flaw in us, and it was not a compulsion we could not control. It was the thing that had kept us alive through all the centuries that could have ended us. The same thing that had sent Owen to his screen at 2 in the morning, and kept him there until he found what was wrong. The same thing that had filled the lunar shipyards with workers who said yes without being asked twice. The same thing that had made Declan position his ship in the debris field 2 hours before I needed it there. The habit of moving toward what frightened us instead of away from it. The stubborn, often inconvenient, occasionally catastrophic, and ultimately irreplaceable habit of not stopping. I boarded the ship. I thanked the crew for their patience. I told them to set course for Earth. There was a council of stewardship to help build, 23 provisions to implement, and 4 to revise in committee, and a galaxy that had just been through something it did not yet have the language to fully describe, and that would need people willing to sit with it through the process of finding that language. There was also, somewhere north of London, a farmhouse in Yorkshire where a retired admiral was almost certainly drinking tea and waiting to hear how it had gone, and 3 cats that did not care one way or the other but would be warm to sit near. The Owen Clark moved out of the docking bay and into open space. The stars, freed from their frame, began to move the way stars move when you are moving through them, which is to say they stayed perfectly still, and everything else changed around them. I watched them for a while. Then I went to work.